Yesterday, he braved the torrential rain to push the wheelchair of the elderly woman abandoned on the street, shielding her from the storm. Days later, when he approached to buy a treat from her as a gesture of recognition, his legs trembled upon seeing her secretly talking to a police officer with a suspicious look. Could she not be who she seemed to be? The rain looked like a thick curtain falling relentlessly that afternoon. Heavy drops hit Brian's face as he tried, at all costs, to get home after a long day at the auto repair shop. The broken umbrella in his left hand let most of the water through, and the toolbox in his right hand felt so heavy it seemed twice its size. He was just a 17-year-old boy, but in recent weeks he had been forced to become an adult. With his father unemployed and his mother sick at home, Brian worked overtime fixing motorcycles and cars to gather any amount he could. The city was on alert because of floods, and he needed to get home soon before the streets became impassable. While passing a corner, an unexpected movement caught his attention. Across the street, an elderly woman in a wheelchair was trying to cross the flood. The murky water hit the wheels, pushing dirt and leaves, making passage difficult. The woman was shaking and trying to hold a worn umbrella that the wind insisted on turning inside out. Brian knew that figure by sight. He had seen her selling candies at the traffic light several times. Now she was there, alone, with her wheelchair tires stuck in the muddy water, fighting against the storm. He stopped walking. For a brief moment he thought about continuing on. After all, he was tired, wet, exhausted after work. But there was something in her expression, the desperation, the contracted face, the difficulty breathing with the wind gusts, that wouldn't let him simply ignore the situation. Without hesitation, Brian put the toolbox down on a small concrete wall that divided the sidewalk and ran to where she was. He held his own umbrella over the woman's head, tilting it to protect her from the heavy drops. The wheelchair wouldn't move, the wheels spinning uselessly on the soaked ground. The old woman tried to say something, but her voice seemed stuck in her throat. "Easy, ma'am," said Brian, putting his shoulder against the wheelchair strap. "I'll get you out of here." She looked at him with teary eyes and mumbled something incomprehensible, her voice swallowed by the force of the rain. He tried once, twice, forcing the chair against the current flowing through the gutter. He felt the cold wind hit his back. The umbrella almost escaped from his hand. A car passed quickly on the wet asphalt, raising a wave of dirty water. Brian forced his feet against the slippery ground, used all his energy to pull the wheels from the accumulated mud. Little by little, inch by inch, he managed to push her to an improvised awning of an abandoned building. There, partially protected from the storm, they could breathe better. The woman was sobbing, shaking. Brian put the closed umbrella aside and bent down to check if she was okay. Her face flushed from cold, hardened hands, soaked clothes. She was older than he remembered, probably nearing 60, with dark, heavy hair stuck to her face. She thanked him through tears, her voice still weak. "Thank you so much, son." She tried to catch her breath. "Few customers today, low sales, pain in my hands, and now this storm." Brian felt a tightness in his chest. He wasn't the only one suffering. The entire city seemed immersed in problems. He thought of his sick mother at home, his distressed father, the overdue bills. Everyone was fighting in their own way. He grabbed the umbrella, opened it again, and tilted it so as not to let her get even more soaked. The old woman, whom he later remembered was called Clara, extended a small package of candies tied with thin string. "As thanks, take some candies." She winked, with still teary eyes. "It's not much, but it's from the heart." Brian smiled simply and refused, shaking his head. "Don't worry about me, Mrs. Clara. Take care. Tomorrow, if I pass by here, I'll buy some candy, okay?" She agreed with a weak gesture. Then he got up, adjusted his backpack, and looked around. The smell of wet earth invaded his nostrils. The storm continued without mercy. In the distance, an acquaintance of his, Jaime, crossed the street hurriedly and waved something to Brian, shouting about a flooded block. There was no time to waste. Brian needed to get home. He left Clara there at a safer spot, sheltered from the rain. He didn't get far. Two men emerged from the alley beside, panting, seeming to look for something. There was something about that dark street, in the irregular blinking of a broken sign, that didn't inspire confidence. One of them bumped hard into Brian. "Hey, watch where you're going, kid," growled the man. "Sorry, sir," said Brian, trying to stay calm. Inside, he felt fatigue and cold taking their toll. The other man looked Brian up and down, with bloodshot eyes. They seemed nervous, agitated. They were talking among themselves about a black bag that someone might have lost around there. Brian didn't understand what it was about, but he recognized the contained fury in their eyes. When he tried to continue, one of them grabbed his shirt collar, demanding money or something of value. Brian tried to break free, slipped on the wet floor, almost fell backwards. He saw Clara in the distance, watching worriedly. He didn't want to complicate things, but he couldn't simply take a beating quietly. He touched the wall, feeling around until he found a loose piece of wood on the ground. He wielded the improvisation and turned his body, pushing away one of the men. They complained, grunted something about the black bag, and then, perhaps afraid of the commotion or the police, gave up, fleeing through the alley. Brian took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He picked up his tools from where he had left them and noticed a small metallic object on the ground. It looked like a lighter, with a symbol engraved on the side. Maybe it belonged to those men. Without thinking much, he put it in his pocket. After so many pushes, the cold water and fear, he just wanted to get home. When he finally approached the housing complex, he spotted Sergeant Davis across the street, a burly policeman with an unfriendly look, known for shady deals. Davis frowned when he saw Brian, especially when he noticed the metallic lighter semi-exposed in the boy's pocket. Brian swallowed hard. Something in that expression made his stomach turn. The rain wasn't the only dirty thing that afternoon. Upon entering home, Brian found his father sitting on the couch, head down, listlessly leafing through some papers, probably bills. His mother was coughing in the bedroom, her voice weakened. The atmosphere was heavy. Brian put the toolbox in the corner, rubbed his wet hands, and tried to comfort them. There wasn't much to say. Before, he just needed to ensure medicine wouldn't run out. But now, after what he saw on the street, the confrontation with the men in the alley, Davis's strange reaction and the lighter in his pocket, it seemed that something bigger was unfolding, something he didn't yet understand. Taking off his soaked jacket, Brian felt a shiver run up his spine. He was just a boy, but he felt himself in the midst of a whirlwind of intrigue. He didn't know Clara well, had only seen her selling candies. She seemed so fragile in that rain, so in need of help. Now, however, the memory of her talking to a suspicious policeman and the mystery of the black bag hung in the air. Nothing sounded simple anymore. He took the lighter from his pocket, looked at the strange symbol, not understanding. He needed to rest, think more carefully after the storm passed. In the small shared bedroom, the weak light from the lamp illuminated the peeling walls. Brian lay down, still hearing the sound of rain falling mercilessly outside. Only this time, the noise wasn't comforting. It was a reminder that the world out there was full of secrets. He couldn't close his eyes. For a long time he stared at the ceiling, imagining what Clara was hiding behind that vulnerable appearance. Why was she on the street in that storm? Who were those men looking for the black bag? And Davis, why had he looked at him with such suspicion? He turned to his side, trying to find a comfortable position on the worn mattress, but sleep wouldn't come. With each drop on the roof, each gust of wind, the image of Clara's face in the rain returned to his mind. If she was just a candy seller, why did she get involved with strange people and corrupt police officers? The night advanced, but Brian remained alert, as if something terrible was about to happen. It was a presentiment, a knot in his stomach, a call to stay alert. He wanted to know more, understand the truth. He closed his eyes, but his mind wouldn't stop. And the question arose by itself, almost like a whisper. Who is Clara really? The next day dawned grayer than ever, but at least the rain wasn't falling as furiously. The neighborhood still carried the strong smell of wet earth and damp garbage in the air, while dark puddles formed in the corners of cracked sidewalks. Brian left home earlier, tired from a poor night's sleep, determined to return to the workshop before going straight home at the end of the day. His father was still dejected. His mother had coughed all night long, and he needed to think of a way out. However, the scene from the previous day still echoed in his head. Clara in the rain, the threat from those men, the strange lighter in his pocket, and Sergeant Davis's fierce gaze. At the workshop, Brian worked in silence, lost in his own thoughts. He cleaned carburetors, tightened screws, changed engine oil, but his mind was far away, trying to piece together a dark puzzle. He had no one to talk to about this. Jamie was a good guy, but didn't understand the gravity of the situation, and the shop owner didn't want to know about employees' personal problems. Still, Jamie's discreet presence there, sometimes casting a curious glance, made Brian feel less alone. In the late afternoon, Brian decided to take a different route home. He didn't want to cross the main streets, feeling watched since yesterday. You could tell something strange was in the air. Closed windows, few people walking quickly, heads down. There was a heavy atmosphere, as if everyone was waiting for something bad. Passing through a narrow alley, further away, Brian smelled the sour stench of accumulated garbage. The noise of a persistent drip came from a broken gutter. That's when something caught his attention. A large black bag, abandoned near the trash cans. It looked heavy, half open. Curiosity was immediate. He looked around. There was no one nearby. His head screamed not to mess with it, but impulse spoke louder. With hands dirty from grease and oil, he pulled the edge of the bag and peered inside. He almost fell backward. Dollar bills, many wrapped, some dirty, others scribbled on, crumpled. A small fortune, thrown there like it was debris. Brian's heart raced. Who would leave so much money there? The first thing he thought was, whose is this? A gang? A drug dealer? He thought of his sick mother, the impending eviction, his unemployed father. This could save his family in the blink of an eye. But he also knew that money like this, abandoned and dirty, didn't come from anything good. He remembered Sergeant Davis, the suspicious look, and Clara, whom he'd helped in the rain. He recalled the men who attacked him in the alley, the mention of a black bag. Could this be the bag they were looking for? If he turned it into the police, Davis might very well pocket it himself, or worse, accuse him of theft. But keeping it was also risky. Uncertainty and fear pulsed within him. Brian carefully closed the bag, folded it, and tried to disguise its bulk. He carried everything back to the workshop unnoticed. There, he stored the money in an old parts box behind a cabinet. Jamie appeared suddenly, frowning. "What are you doing there, Brian?" "Nothing, just storing some stuff," he lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're white as paper. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, just tired, nothing much," he replied, avoiding his friend's gaze. The workshop was silent, just the distant street noise and some drops falling into a bucket. A cold draft blew through a broken window, knocking a screwdriver to the floor. The dry sound made Brian jump. Jamie gave a nervous laugh. "Man, this place is weird today. I don't know, seems like the wind is foretelling something bad." "Just your imagination," said Brian, with a lump in his throat. He couldn't tell. Not now. He didn't know who to trust. He kept the secret of the money, trying to act naturally. On the street, he noticed that the neighborhood dog, which used to bark non-stop, was strangely silent, as if it too sensed danger. People seemed suspicious, looking over their shoulders. Brian left the workshop with quick steps, his head spinning. The doubt was cruel. Hide the money and risk attracting criminals? Return it to whom? He had no idea who the owners were. Go to the police? But Davis was part of something dirty, he could feel it. Thinking about everything, Brian decided to return home and try to think more about it. The slight wound on his arm, made by one of the bandits' knife, burned under his damp shirt. He avoided passing near the corner where he'd met Clara yesterday. He preferred deserted streets, but the feeling of being followed persisted. Sometimes it seemed like a black car was lurking in the distance, then disappearing around a corner. Reaching his neighborhood, the sky remained covered by heavy clouds, but the rain was gentler. Some lights on here and there, reflections in the standing water of puddles. Brian turned the last corner before reaching the housing complex and stopped for a second to breathe. His chest felt tight, as if the air was thin. He needed to see if his parents were okay, if there was any bad news. He took a few steps and reached his house door. That's when, as he put his hand on the doorknob, something caught his attention at the end of the street. At a point where the streetlight emitted a yellowish and trembling glow, there were two figures. One of them was Clara, unmistakable, the same lady he had helped in the downpour. But this time she wasn't alone, nor did she seem helpless. Before her, someone in a police uniform was talking in a low voice. Brian frowned, his heart racing as if it would jump out of his chest. Did he recognize the rigid profile of Sergeant Davis or some other police officer? He couldn't be sure. It was dark, and the distance didn't help, but the uniform left little doubt. This wasn't just anyone. Clara gestured a lot, tilted her head as if she was telling a secret or negotiating something. The figure beside her remained firm, chin up. That chilled Brian's spine. Clara wasn't just a vulnerable lady, a candy seller suffering in the rain. She was indeed involved with the police, or at least with someone wearing that uniform. Why? What kind of shady business involved her? Brian felt his legs shake. He remembered the money he found, the lighter with the strange symbol, the men who attacked him. Everything seemed connected. Clara talking secretly with a police officer only confirmed that nothing was what it seemed. Could she be part of that crime network? Or was she being coerced? He wanted to get closer, hear better, but knew that would be risky. He already had enough problems. If Davis or some accomplice saw him, it could mean serious trouble. So he stood still, undecided, spying from afar, his heart in his mouth. The wind brought an indistinct murmur of raised voices. Clara gestured. The officer looked around. For a moment, the lady raised her face and her gaze met Brian's, even from afar. Time seemed to freeze. Did she recognize him? Did she see him standing there, stunned? In the next instant, Clara turned quickly, seeming to end the conversation. The officer took 2 steps back, disappearing into the darkness. Clara turned her wheelchair wheels with unusual firmness, moving away. In a few seconds, the corner was deserted again, only the sound of dripping and the buzz of the streetlight. Brian swallowed hard. That scene wouldn't leave his head. Clara and a police officer together, at nightfall, on the silent street. What were they plotting? Was there any connection to the bag of money? To the metallic lighter? Who were the men who attacked him? And above all, who was Clara really? Upon opening his house door, Brian sees a figure at the end of the street. Clara talking to someone in police uniform. The next day dawned grayer than ever, but at least the rain wasn't falling as furiously. The neighborhood still carried the strong smell of wet earth and damp garbage in the air, while dark puddles formed in the corners of the cracked sidewalks. Brian left home earlier, tired from the poorly slept night, determined to return to the shop before going straight home at the end of the day. His father remained dejected. His mother had coughed all night long, and he needed to think of a way out. However, the scene from the previous day still echoed in his head. Clara in the rain, the threat from those men, the strange lighter in his pocket, and Sergeant Davis's fierce look. At the shop, Brian worked in silence, lost in his own thoughts. He cleaned carburetors, tightened screws, changed engine oil, but his mind was far away, trying to piece together a dark puzzle. He had no one to talk to about this. Jaime was a good guy, but didn't understand the gravity of the situation, and the shop owner didn't want to know about employees' personal problems. Still, Jaime's discreet presence there, occasionally casting a curious glance, made Brian feel less alone. In the late afternoon, Brian decided to take a different route home. He didn't want to cross the main streets, feeling watched since yesterday. You could tell something strange hung in the air. Closed windows, few people walking quickly, heads down. There was a heavy atmosphere, as if everyone was waiting for something bad. Passing through a narrow alley, more secluded, Brian smelled the sour odor of accumulated garbage. The noise of a persistent drip came from a broken gutter. That's when something caught his attention. A large black bag, abandoned near the trash cans. It looked heavy, half open. Curiosity was immediate. He looked around. There was no one nearby. His head screamed not to mess with it, but impulse spoke louder. With hands dirty from grease and oil, he pulled the edge of the bag and peeked inside. He almost fell backward. Dollar bills, many, wrapped, some dirty, others scribbled on, crumpled. A small fortune, thrown there like it was debris. Brian's heart raced. Who would leave so much money there? The first thing he thought was, whose is this? A gang, a drug dealer. He thought of his sick mother, the imminent eviction, his unemployed father. This could save his family in the blink of an eye. But he also knew that money like this, abandoned and dirty, didn't come from anything good. He remembered Sergeant Davis, the suspicious look, and Clara, whom he'd helped in the rain. He recalled the men who attacked him in the alley, the mention of a black bag. Could this be the bag they were looking for? If he turned it in to the police, Davis might very well pocket it himself, or worse, accuse him of theft. But keeping it was also risky. Uncertainty and fear pulsed within him. Brian carefully closed the bag, folded it, and tried to disguise its volume. He carried everything back to the shop, unnoticed. There he stored the money in an old parts box, behind a cabinet. Jaime appeared suddenly, frowning. "What are you doing there, Brian?" "Nothing, just storing some stuff," he lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're white as paper. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, just tired. Nothing major," he answered, avoiding his friend's gaze. The shop was silent, only the distant street noise and some drops falling into a bucket. A cold draft blew through a broken window, knocking a screwdriver to the floor. The dry sound made Brian jump. Jaime gave a nervous laugh. "Man, this place is weird today. I don't know. Seems like the wind is forecasting something bad." "It's your imagination," said Brian with a lump in his throat. He couldn't tell. Not now. He didn't know who to trust. He kept the secret of the money, trying to act naturally. On the street, he noticed that the neighborhood dog, which used to bark non-stop, was strangely silent, as if it too sensed danger. People seemed suspicious, looking over their shoulders. Brian left the shop with quick steps, his head spinning. The doubt was cruel. Hide the money and risk attracting criminals? Return it to whom? He had no idea who the owners were. Go to the police? But Davis was part of something dirty. He felt that. Thinking about everything, Brian decided to return home and try to think more about it. The slight wound on his arm, made by one of the bandits' knives, stung under his damp shirt. He avoided passing near the corner where he'd met Clara yesterday. He preferred deserted streets, but the sensation of being followed persisted. Sometimes it seemed like a black car was lurking in the distance, then disappeared around a corner. Arriving in his neighborhood, the sky remained covered by heavy clouds, but the rain was gentler. Some lights on here and there, reflections in the standing water of puddles. Brian turned the last corner before reaching the housing complex and stopped for a second to breathe. His chest felt tight, as if the air was thin. He needed to see if his parents were okay, if there was any bad news. He took a few steps and reached his house door. That's when, as he put his hand on the doorknob, something caught his attention at the end of the street. At a point where the street light emitted a yellowish and trembling glow, there were two figures. One of them was Clara, unmistakable, the same lady he had helped in the downpour. But this time she wasn't alone, nor did she seem helpless. Before her, someone in police uniform was talking in a low voice. Brian frowned, his heart racing as if it would jump out of his chest. Did he recognize the rigid profile of Sergeant Davis or some other police officer? He couldn't be sure. It was dark, and the distance didn't help, but the uniform left little doubt. This wasn't just anyone. Clara gestured a lot, tilted her head as if she was telling a secret or negotiating something. The figure beside her remained firm, chin raised. That chilled Brian's spine. Clara wasn't just a vulnerable lady, a candy seller suffering in the rain. She was indeed involved with the police, or at least with someone wearing that uniform. Why? What kind of obscure business involved her? Brian felt his legs shake. He remembered the money he'd found, the lighter with the strange symbol, the men who attacked him. Everything seemed connected. Clara talking secretly with a police officer only confirmed that nothing was what it seemed. Could she be part of that crime network? Or was she being coerced? He wanted to get closer, hear better, but knew that would be risky. He already had enough problems. If Davis or some accomplice saw him, it could mean serious trouble. So he stood still, undecided, spying from afar, his heart in his mouth. The wind brought an indistinct murmur of altered voices. Clara gestured. The officer looked around. For a moment, the lady raised her face and her gaze met Brian's, even from afar. Time seemed to freeze. Did she recognize him? Did she see him standing there, stunned? In the next instant, Clara turned quickly, seeming to end the conversation. The officer took 2 steps back, disappearing into the darkness. Clara turned her wheelchair wheels with unusual firmness, moving away. In a few seconds, the corner was deserted again, only the sound of dripping and the buzz of the streetlight lamp. Brian swallowed hard. That scene wouldn't leave his head. Clara and a police officer together, at nightfall, on the silent street. What were they plotting? Was there any connection to the bag of money? To the metallic lighter? Who were the men who attacked him? And above all, who was Clara really? Upon opening his house door, Brian sees a figure at the end of the street. Clara talking to someone in police uniform. Brian remained on the roof for a long time, his arm hurting and his head burning with questions. The sight of Clara looking at him, standing there at the corner, was etched in his mind like a brand of fire. Who was she really? Why was she so interested in him? Before getting any answers, she moved slowly, as if recognizing him, and left unhurriedly, disappearing into the wet street. Brian felt a shiver, as if her gaze had left an unspoken warning. With difficulty, he climbed down the fire escape, using all caution not to slip. The hand holding the railing was shaking, and he noticed there were small bloodstains on his shirt from the cut he had received. Once on the ground, still alert to any noise, he found that the 3 men had vanished. Perhaps frustrated, perhaps just lurking around another corner. Either way, he needed to get out of there. He followed less busy routes, eyes alert to every shadow. His arm throbbed, and Brian pressed the wound with his hand, trying to stop the light bleeding. Fear still pulsed in his chest. He reached the workshop without being followed. At least that's what it seemed. Inside, the familiar smell of oil and grease brought a hint of normality, even though everything was far from normal. Jaime was in the back area, organizing boxes of parts. When he saw Brian, he raised an eyebrow. "Man, what's with that face? "You're pale," asked Jaime, approaching. "Everything's fine," replied Brian, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just cut myself on a rusty wire in the street." "Be careful with that. It could get infected. There's a first aid kit inside," indicated Jaime, concerned. Brian agreed with a nod and headed to the small tool room. There, without witnesses, he knelt near the cabinet in the back, where he had hidden the money bag. Driven by uncertainty, he opened the box and checked if the money was still there. It was. A dirty fortune, crumpled and scribbled bills, an evil treasure that seemed to weigh heavier on his conscience with each passing second. Maybe that money belonged to the gang that was now hunting him. Maybe Clara had something to do with it. Somehow, this secret involved corrupt police officers, dangerous people, a vicious circle of threats and fear. After locking the cabinet again, Brian looked at himself in a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. His tired eyes, the dark circles, the tense expression. He was just a boy who wanted to help his family survive. Why did he have to deal with all this? He rested his forehead against the cold wall, took a deep breath, and went for the first aid kit. He cleaned the cut with alcohol, bit his lip to hold back the pain, and bandaged his arm as best he could. Meanwhile, he thought about his mother, sick at home, and his father, desperate with bills and eviction knocking at the door. They had 2 days, just 2, before losing their roof. This was unbearable. The dirty money could solve everything, but at what cost? It was too risky to keep it. Brian felt trapped in a dead end. He couldn't trust the authorities, couldn't trust Clara or anyone. Desperate, he imagined that maybe Clara had the answers. If she knew the police officer and was involved, she could tell him who owned the fortune. Maybe suggest a safe way out? Determined, Brian left the workshop that afternoon, intending to locate Clara. He walked to the corner where he had first seen her in the wheelchair. The ground still showed tire marks, possibly from the chair. The wind carried a smell of wet earth. No sign of her. He tried passing by other corners, searched the area where she used to sell candy. Nothing. It was as if she had evaporated. When returning home, the landscape seemed even more hostile. Closed gates, curious eyes peeping through windows, rusty car bodies abandoned on the street. Brian opened the door and found his father sitting, holding a crumpled paper in his hand. His expression was that of a cornered man. "Son, I got another notice from the building owner. 2 days and he'll put us out." Brian felt a tightness in his chest. I know, Dad. I'm trying to find a way out. I don't know what else to do. Your mother's weak. I can't leave her on the street. We need money and I have nowhere to get it," lamented his father, voice trembling. The words hit Brian like hammer blows. There, in the workshop cabinet, was enough money to pay that rent and much more. But it was money stained with danger. On the other hand, leaving it there was risking being found by criminals or a corrupt police officer. The dilemma was inevitable. Brian swallowed his anguish and went up to his room. He needed to think. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands on his head, remembering the threatening look of the men in the alley and Clara's enigmatic figure. Why didn't she appear anymore? Why not try to find him to talk about it? Was it all just a game to test him? He squeezed the metal lighter in his pocket, the object he had found on the ground. The strange symbol engraved there must have some meaning. Maybe it was the gang's mark. If only he knew how to decipher it, he might find a way. The next day, Brian gathered courage and took a walk around the workshop's block before entering. He needed to ensure no one was following him. He observed every parked car, every strange face. Then he saw him. Standing across the street, leaning against a pole with his hands in his pockets, was Sergeant Davis. The burly police officer, the cold look, dressed in plain clothes, but unmistakable. He wasn't saying anything, just staring at the workshop entrance. He was like a wolf waiting for its prey. A chill ran through Brian's body. Davis was watching him. Why now? Had he discovered something about the money, Or had Clara informed him? Brian pretended not to notice him and quickly entered the workshop, locking the door behind him. Inside, he tried to concentrate on work, but couldn't. He thought about Davis outside, the lighter in his pocket, the money bag in the cabinet. Everything seemed like an impossible knot to untie. At every noise outside, Brian startled, imagining Davis bursting through the door. If the officer really knew something, he could easily incriminate him. There was no way to denounce someone corrupt without evidence. And even if there was, the dirty money would make him suspicious. The afternoon dragged on, but when Brian finally gathered the courage to peek through the side window, Davis was no longer there. The officer had gone, but the tension remained. Returning home at nightfall, Brian noticed that the neighborhood's atmosphere was even tenser. Nobody was talking. Few were walking in the streets. The storm had diminished, but thick clouds still hung in the sky, promising more rain. He thought about Clara, the money, Davis. He needed a plan, but didn't have one. When he entered home, he found his mother sleeping poorly, coughing from time to time, and his father sitting in a corner, head buried in his hands. The situation was desperate, and Brian saw no easy way out. He needed to decide. Risk his integrity by taking that money to try to save his family, or find a way to turn it in without falling into the hands of criminals or a corrupt police officer. He thought that maybe Clara had a reason for all this theater. Maybe she wanted to blackmail him. Maybe she wanted him to make a wrong move. He didn't know. He only knew that he was at the center of a dangerous web. Opening his bedroom window and looking at the dark street, he imagined Davis prowling around, waiting for a slip-up to attack him. Or Clara, appearing in the middle of the night, demanding the money back. Brian ran his hand over his injured arm, feeling the slight burning of the bandage. He could no longer ignore the imminent danger. Things were reaching a critical point. With a heavy heart, he whispered to himself, facing the darkness outside. If Davis knows I'm involved, what will he do now? He woke up before dawn, tired and with a head heavy with worries. The night had been a whirlwind of thoughts, and Brian knew he needed to act soon. His family couldn't wait, the eviction deadline was running out, and his mother's health wasn't improving. If he stayed still, everything would collapse on them. There was that strange promise from Clara. She seemed to know something about the black bag of money, about the dangerous people around, and about what to do with that mysterious fortune. As unwise as it seemed, Brian believed Clara could be his only way out, even if he didn't trust her completely. He left home without saying anything to his parents, just saying he would try to resolve the situation. The sky was cloudy, an opaque gray covering the streets. The rain had given a small break, but the air still smelled of wet earth. Brian walked with quick steps, avoiding the most obvious routes, keeping his eyes alert. He needed to find Clara, needed to talk to her and extract some useful information. Maybe she would explain what the hell was going on. As he approached the corner where it all began, the place where he had helped Clara during the storm, he spotted the candy seller's figure. There she was, sitting in her wheelchair, arranging some candies wrapped in colorful papers. The environment was drier, the sidewalk still had puddles, but the flood had already receded. The sun was timidly trying to break through the clouds, creating a less oppressive atmosphere. Approaching, Brian felt butterflies in his stomach. Clara raised her eyes as soon as she noticed his presence. There wasn't the same look of weakness on her face from that first encounter. Now she seemed to measure the boy carefully, almost as if evaluating him. "You came back," she said, adjusting the candy cart in front of her, her voice soft but distant. "I need answers," Brian replied firmly. "I saw you talking to a police officer the other day, and I don't seem to be the only one after that bag of money. You know something about this, don't you?" Clara took a deep breath, her lips pursed as if she didn't want to reveal everything. Then she leaned forward, with an air of confidence. "Boy, what you found out there isn't what you think. That money doesn't fall from the sky, nor is it just from a common gang. There are very dangerous people involved. Dangerous people? Like who? Brian narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher her expression. And the police officer? Why were you talking to him? Clara looked away, turned the wheelchair wheel slightly, changing position. The police officer, he might be on the wrong side of the law, or he might just be trying to understand who took the money that was at stake. I can't say much, but I know one thing. If you return this amount to the right person, you can get out of this unharmed. You might even get something in return, cleanly. Brian was silent for a moment, processing the words. Return the money to whom? Would it be another trick? What if it was just a trap to take everything from him, including his life? At the same time, he thought of his family. He needed to resolve the situation. He felt his pulse quicken. How will I know who to return it to? I don't know anyone besides these lunatics who want to kill me, he said resentfully, remembering the attack in the alley. I know someone who can help, but it won't be here, nor now. The city is full of eyes lurking, wanting to tear pieces from both of us. Clara looked around, lowering her voice. This afternoon, there's an abandoned warehouse near the river. Go there and I'll introduce someone who can make your life easier. It's someone who knows how to deal with this kind of problem and won't leave you high and dry. Brian didn't know if he trusted her, but the words, make your life easier and won't leave you high and dry, hooked him. He needed a way out. He was cornered. The thugs after him, Davis watching, the family on the verge of eviction. Clara seemed to be the only one offering a light, even if it was just a firefly in the darkness. What if it's a trap? He questioned, his voice coming out louder than intended. Clara raised her hand to calm him. I have no interest in traps, kid. You helped me in that rain, remember? I haven't forgotten your kindness. If I wanted to screw you over, I would have done it already. But nothing in this life is free. Don't expect a miraculous solution. You'll have to trust me. He bit his lip, looking at the candies in her cart. Everything seemed so simple in that scene, but he knew that behind that countenance and that wheelchair, there were secrets. Still, desperate for a path, he saw no better option. Time was running against him. All right, he finally agreed. What time and where exactly? At dusk, the old warehouse near the riverbank. You know where it is? The one with peeling walls and a broken sign in front. Go alone, bring the money. There, you'll meet someone who can guide you. But arrive before dark, understood? Brian nodded, feeling a knot in his stomach. The abandoned warehouse was known to be a sinister place, never closed, always ready to shelter addicts or vagrants. But if Clara said she had a contact there, maybe it was his best chance to escape the tight spot he was in. She looked at him with a half smile. It's not an offer that's made twice. Take advantage. Right, said Brian, already moving away, not knowing what to think of that smile. As he turned the corner, his head was burning. He wanted to believe Clara was helping him out of gratitude, but he couldn't ignore that she had her own interests. Maybe she wanted to use Brian as a pawn in this game. Either way, he didn't have much to lose. The family needed the money, or at least a way out that didn't involve violence. He returned to the workshop to get the hidden bag of notes. Jaime wasn't around. The place was empty, which made the task easier. As he lifted the box of parts and removed the black bag full of notes, Brian's heart raced. It was a lot of money, enough to change many people's lives, but also enough to attract death. In his heart, he prayed he had made the right choice. Now everything was decided. He would go to the warehouse, meet the person indicated by Clara, and try to end that agony. If there was a minimal chance of resolving the situation without bloodshed, he needed to grab it. He looked once more at the bag, heavy in his hands, and took a deep breath. Time was running and dusk wouldn't be long in coming. Brian closes the workshop door with the bag in hand, heading to the warehouse, praying it wasn't a trap. At dusk, The sky took on a rusty hue, and the weak light of the dying sun cast elongated shadows on the deserted streets. Brian moved forward with hesitant steps toward the abandoned warehouse, the black bag hidden inside a garbage cart that he pushed as if it were just debris. His heart was beating so hard it hurt. In his head, a confusion of fears and hopes. Clara had promised a solution, but what if it was all just a trap? The warehouse appeared before him like a decrepit giant. Peeling walls, rusty metal doors, broken glass in the higher windows. The smell was of dust, rust, and rancid oil. Brian took a deep breath, stopping near a dark corner before entering. He needed to be careful. He left the garbage cart with the bag outside, disguised among other debris. If something went wrong, he didn't want the money in his hands right away. As he crossed the main door, he had to force his way through, pushing with his shoulder. The place was spacious, a large span with stained floors, fallen shelves, and scattered metal pieces. Dark stains on the floor and ceiling indicated water damage. The late afternoon light entered through cracks and broken windows, creating shadowy areas where someone could hide. Clara was there, standing in the center, the wheelchair on a drier surface, almost as if waiting for his arrival to start a show. By her side, emerging from the shadows, Brian noticed Sergeant Davis, the burly police officer with the threatening look. Brian's chest tightened. So that was it. Clara and Davis together. There was no third ally, no clean negotiation. He had been deceived. "Well, well, boy," said Davis, his deep voice echoing through the empty warehouse. "Come to bring us what's ours." "Ours?" Brian stammered, incredulous, feeling his mouth go dry. "Clara, you—" Clara looked at him without showing pity. Her face no longer expressed the fragile sweetness from the day they met in the rain. Now there was something hard in her eyes, a cold determination. "You were useful, Brian. I needed to get the money off the street without drawing attention from the real owners, and you showed up like a lamb. The rain, the help, it all served for me to evaluate how far you'd go for an act of kindness." Brian felt his stomach turn. It was like taking a punch to the chest. So she had lied the whole time, pretending to be a helpless victim. The boy looked around, searching for escape routes, but stopped upon hearing footsteps echoing in the back of the warehouse. A trio of attackers appeared, the same men who had threatened him before, now reinforced by two more armed accomplices. It was a complete ambush. "Where's the money, kid?" one of them barked, stepping forward. Brian raised his hands, trying to calm them. His voice came out shaky. It's outside. I didn't bring it directly, left it in a cart. Thought it would be safer that way." Davis shot an impatient look at Clara, who raised her eyebrows, bored. "Go get it," Davis ordered one of his thugs, gesturing with his head. The man left, hurried. The tension was unbearable. Brian was trembling, thinking about his family, his sick mother. He tried to buy time. "Why me, Clara? Why involve me in this?" "Because you're weak, but with a heavy conscience. I knew you would keep the money without giving it to anyone, and that in the end, desperation would make you fall for my conversation," she replied, her tone almost didactic, as if explaining something simple. "Now, either you reveal exactly where the bag is, or we can send a message to your family. Understand?" Her words sounded ice cold. Brian wanted to scream but controlled himself. He needed a chance, a second of carelessness. He looked at Davis, who was smiling with yellowed teeth, satisfied like a predator before its prey. Brian began, hesitant. "I left the cart outside near the side door. It's not far. If you follow that way, you'll see it." Davis approached, gun in hand, the barrel pointing at Brian. The thugs tightened the circle, making any escape attempt difficult. Brian swallowed hard. Clara just watched, without saying another word. Suddenly, hearing noises outside, the thug who had gone to fetch the cart returned, empty-handed and with a confused expression. There's nothing out there but garbage. Where's the bag, kid? Brian bit his lip. He needed to create a distraction. He looked around, spotted a rotten crate near the right pillar. With a risky impulse, he pretended to run in that direction. A thug grabbed his arm, delivering a punch to his stomach. Brian doubled over, feeling the sharp pain, but held back a groan. He couldn't give up. While pretending weakness, he noticed a loose piece of metal on the floor. "Look here, kid," said Davis, bringing his face close. "I don't have time to play. Where's the money?" Brian raised his head, sweating. He needed to distract their attention. In a hoarse voice, he murmured, "It's in the cart, on the other side of the building. I pushed it to the side alley. That's why you didn't see it." Davis stepped back, irritated, and ordered another thug to go check. At that moment, Brian brushed his hand on the floor and grabbed the piece of metal, hiding it in his palm. "It won't help, kid. Any trick and you and your family will regret it," said Clara, her voice cold as the night wind. Brian saw the moment to act. With Davis and Clara focused on his lies, the thugs dispersed trying to find the bag. There was a small chance. When one of the men got distracted looking at the door, Brian suddenly rose up, striking the arm of the aggressor who held him with the piece of metal. The man howled in pain, releasing him. The spark of chaos. Davis raised the gun, fired, and the bullet hit a metal beam. The sound echoed like thunder. Brian ducked down, rolling on the floor to a nearby crate. Another thug advanced, but Brian pulled a loose manhole cover and raised it as an improvised shield. The second shot ricocheted off the cover, creating sparks. "Get him!" roared Davis, his voice distorted by rage. Brian, breathless, saw Clara moving with agility, trying to circle around the fight to leave the warehouse. She wasn't as helpless as she seemed. The way she pushed the wheelchair indicated unusual dexterity. The boy grabbed a fallen iron bar and swung it in front of a thug, who backed away scared. He kicked a pile of pipes, making them roll across the floor, hindering the pursuers. Amid the chaos, Brian maneuvered to escape through the side door. He felt his heart exploding in his chest, the pain in his stomach from the punch. But adrenaline overcame everything. He needed to get out of there alive. He wouldn't keep the money, that was clear, and he couldn't let Clara or Davis win. When he reached the exit, he still heard Davis shout, furious, "Where's the money, boy?" Brian went out into the alley, breathing the cold air, hearing the muffled steps and shouts behind him. He knew he didn't have much time. He needed to find help. Someone trustworthy. Someone who could put an end to this mess. Brian feels despair rising in his throat. Brian ran to the side alley, breathing in short gasps, his body still aching from the punches and kicks received inside the warehouse. He tried to think of an escape route, but the pain in his stomach and the fear in his throat made it difficult. He heard hurried footsteps approaching, shouts of hatred reverberating off the damp walls. There was nowhere to go. A high fence blocked the exit, and climbing in that state would be impossible. Before he could react, 2 thugs appeared at the entrance of the alley, blocking his path. Then, Davis appeared with his face twisted in anger, gun in hand, followed by Clara, who stayed a bit behind, watching the scene coldly. The heavy air smelled of rust and dirt, and the end-of-day light stretched the shadows on the soaked ground. "Is the game over, kid?" asked Davis, approaching with slow steps. "Where's the money?" The gun gleamed under the weak light, pointed directly at Brian's chest. There was no escaping this time. He needed to think fast. He swallowed hard, raising his hands in surrender, pretending to give up. His legs were shaking, but his voice came out surprisingly firm. "All right. I surrender. You can stop. Enough. I'll take you to the money. It's hidden over there," he said, indicating with his chin a direction in the corner of the alley. Davis narrowed his eyes, suspicious, but the kid's desperate demeanor seemed convincing. 2 thugs exchanged glances, ready to verify the information. Clara didn't say anything, just stayed there, silent, as if she had already expected this outcome. "If you try any tricks, you know what happens, right?" whispered Davis, his voice hard. "Your family pays the price." Brian nodded, swallowing his anger. He needed an opening, a second of distraction. He knew the garbage cart with the money bag was still on the other side of the building, near the main entrance. If he could lure everyone there, maybe he'd have a chance. He made a vague sign with his head, indicating that the money was further ahead, in another alley on the opposite side, as if to say they had to go around. One of the thugs moved away to confirm the information, walking quickly through the shadows. Meanwhile, Brian carefully approached Davis, as if wanting to hand something over. The corrupt police officer raised the gun a little higher, keeping the boy under constant aim. "Come on, move," ordered Davis, poking Brian with the gun barrel. The boy pretended to stumble, leaning on one of the men's arms. At that moment, he saw a rusty wrench on the ground, dropped among metal scraps. Without thinking twice, Brian suddenly lowered his body, pretending to tie his shoelace, and in an unexpected move, lifted the wrench, hitting the knee of the thug who was holding him. The man screamed in pain, staggering. Davis turned the gun, surprised, but before shooting, Brian lunged forward, hitting the sergeant's wrist with the wrench, deflecting the aim. The gunshot sound was hollow. The bullet ricocheted off the concrete without hitting anyone. Brian, breathless, took advantage of the confusion and ran to the opposite side, knowing he had little time. Clara backed away at the sight of the tumult, skillfully spinning her wheelchair wheels to avoid being knocked over. The other thugs fumbled, trying to surround Brian. The boy, however, was agile. He left the alley and ran around the abandoned building, feeling the adrenaline pulse. He had a simple plan: recover the garbage cart with the money bag and try to use it to his advantage. A few meters from the warehouse's main entrance, there was the cart, heavy, full of dirty and crumpled bills. Brian grabbed the handle and, with effort, pushed it all at once in the direction Clara and Davis would come. He had barely hidden behind a rusty pillar when he heard the squeaking of wheels on the uneven floor. Clara appeared first, followed by Davis and the thugs. Seeing the cart advancing toward her, the woman tried to turn her wheelchair away, but the uneven terrain didn't help. The cart, pushed with force, hit her with impact, throwing her to the ground. The shock was abrupt, the candies and papers that were in her cart scattering across the dirty floor. Now she didn't seem so helpless. Davis roared with hatred, pointing the gun once again, but Brian had already ducked down, picking up a piece of wood lying nearby. With a quick strike, he hit the police officer's hand, who dropped the gun. A thug advanced, trying to grab Brian, but the boy dodged, kicking a metal box at his legs. The man stumbled, falling against an iron beam. Another thug tried to surround Brian from behind, but the boy spun his body, dazed, and found a piece of pipe. With a side strike, he disarmed the aggressor. Everything was happening quickly, the noise of crashes and screams echoing in the warehouse. Brian felt his heart racing. He wasn't a fighter, had never done this before, but fear and desperation propelled him, giving him an energy he didn't know he had. On the ground, Clara tried to compose herself, moving her legs under her clothes, which seemed unlikely for someone supposedly disabled. It became clear that the whole wheelchair act was part of her disguise. Davis, disoriented, searched for the fallen gun among the debris. The other thugs cursed, trying to regroup. Brian couldn't stay there forever. Taking advantage of the opening, he ran to the warehouse's back exit, his chest burning and his breathing short. He needed to escape definitively, put distance between himself and those people. Without looking back, he followed a narrow corridor, jumped over debris, scratching his hands on exposed ironwork, until reaching a poorly lit side street. The sky had become even darker, and night was advancing, bringing a cutting cold. Brian knew they would follow him, that they wouldn't give up so easily. But at least now he wasn't under the immediate aim of a gun, and had managed to create enough chaos to disrupt them. Without thinking about the distant future, just the next corner, Brian ran. the sound of his own footsteps echoing, his hands trembling with pain, his throat dry. He needed to find someone trustworthy, an ally who had no ties to crime or corruption. Who could it be? Who in the city still maintained untouched honor? As he turned the corner, Brian came face to face with an honest police officer, Ramirez, arriving, attracted by the sound of gunshots. Brian turned the corner breathless, his body aching and his mind in turmoil, when he almost crashed into a police officer of medium stature, with a serious but familiar face. It was Officer Ramirez, a man known in the neighborhood for not turning a blind eye to injustice. Upon seeing Brian so disturbed, Ramirez raised one hand, asking for calm, and rested the other on his gun holster, but without drawing it. "Calm down, kid. Is something happening?" asked Ramirez, his voice firm yet welcoming. Brian swallowed hard, trying to catch his breath. He could still smell the rust from the warehouse in his nostrils, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He wanted to tell everything at once, but the words came out truncated. They tried to kill me. Davis, Clara, the gang, yeah," he muttered, pointing toward the warehouse. "They're there, after the money. I found a black bag full of cash, and now they want to blame me. My family's in danger." Ramirez frowned upon hearing the name Davis. The sergeant was known, but not for noble reasons. It was known in the neighborhood that his colleague didn't have a clean record, but it was hard to prove anything. Ramirez looked around, alert to the corners of the street, as if expecting to see some thug emerging from the shadows. "Calm down. Breathe," he said, touching Brian's shoulder. "Tell me slowly. You said Davis? Sergeant Davis?" Brian nodded, panting. "Yes, he's involved. There's a group of criminals. They want a bag of money I found by chance. Clara, that lady in the wheelchair, she's involved too. They were going to kill me. I don't know who to trust." Ramirez analyzed the boy, his dirty clothes, the cut on his arm, the desperate expression. He didn't seem to be lying, and Davis's name wasn't a surprise to him. Cautiously, Ramirez took a step back, looking at the deserted street. "Come with me," said the officer. "Let's find a safe place away from here. I believe you, but I need evidence, something concrete to bring down Davis and these criminals. Can you show me the bag? The money?" Brian felt relief, but at the same time anxiety. "Yes, but it's dangerous. They're after me. The bag is in the warehouse or nearby, hidden. I can't fall into their trap again." Ramirez nodded. He needed to act quickly but intelligently. If Davis was indeed involved, he couldn't simply call the local police station. There could be other corrupt officers. He would need to bring reinforcements from outside, or at least photograph the evidence. In a corner of the street, there was an abandoned workshop that previously served as a meeting point for residents to repair bicycles. Ramirez led Brian there, peering in first to ensure they were alone. Upon entering the dirty room full of old tools, Ramirez pulled out a pocket flashlight. "Tell me more details. This bag of money, where did it come from?" Brian explained what he knew, how he had found it in the alley, dirty and scribbled on, with no apparent owner. He described Clara pretending to be helpless, Davis and the thugs appearing, the threats, the pointed gun, the attempted robbery. He showed the metal lighter with the strange symbol, taking it from his pocket. Ramirez took the object, illuminating it with the flashlight. "This symbol, I've heard of it. It's believed to be from a gang that's been wanted for a long time, known for extorting merchants. If Davis is connected to them, this is serious. We can use it as evidence." Brian looked at the officer with some hope. Ramirez seemed honest. There was no arrogance in his voice, no falseness in his gaze. He seemed genuinely concerned, a man tired of seeing corruption around him. Still, Brian hesitated. He had trusted Clara, and look what happened. "Can I trust you?" asked Brian, his voice uncertain. "I don't want to put my family at risk." Ramirez took a deep breath, facing the boy. "Listen, I'm no saint, but I won't dirty my hands with crimes. I've suspected Davis for a while, but had no proof. Now, with your testimony, the lighter, and if we can find the money with this gang's markings, we have something to take to the right authorities. But we need to act fast. Brian agreed, still trembling. Ramirez proposed a quick plan. Lure Davis and his accomplices to a location with security cameras where they could record the attempt to recover the money. This would require risk, but it was necessary. Brian swallowed hard, remembering the violence seen earlier, but knew that running wouldn't solve anything. "I'll need your help," said Ramirez seriously. "You know these guys. You know what they're capable of. But if we can lure them to a street with security cameras, we can film the confession or some criminal action. Then I'll send the footage to some trusted contacts in the department. That way we'll have solid evidence. Are you in?" Brian hesitated. It was risky, but what about his family, the eviction, his sick mother? He needed to end this madness. "All right, I'm in. But what if they react, try to kill me again?" "I'll be there, protecting you," assured Ramirez. "I'll request backup from some colleagues from another zone, people who can't be bought. We won't leave you alone, but I need you to be there to attract their attention. Davis wants the money, and if he believes you still have it, he'll come running." Brian took a deep breath. He needed to be strong. He leaned on an old wooden workbench. "Okay, where and when?" Ramirez thought for a moment. "There's a secondary street, not far from here, that still has a working private security camera installed by a merchant. It's a quiet place without much movement. If Davis comes, we'll have the record. You show up there, pretend you're going to hand over the money. When they start talking, trying to extort, we surround the place, okay?" "Okay," agreed Brian, feeling a mix of fear and hope. "But I still need to get the money bag. They might demand to see the amount." "Right. Get the money, but don't risk too much. If you prefer, I'll go with you. Together we'll have better chances," said Ramirez, putting away the flashlight and adjusting his gun belt. Brian approved the idea. Maybe it would be safer to have the officer's company. But this could also discourage Davis from exposing himself. Ramirez proposed, "First you show yourself alone, from a distance. When they get close, I'll appear. That way they won't suspect anything." The boy agreed, tense. He had been through so much, now he found himself planning a trap against a corrupt sergeant, risking his own skin. But it was the only way out. He needed to end this dirty plot, save his family, and maybe put an end to Davis and Clara's reign of terror. Ramirez put his hand on Brian's shoulder as a gesture of support. "It will work out, trust me. They will be unmasked. I'll ensure your safety, kid." Brian took a deep breath, preparing himself psychologically. As he left the abandoned workshop, ready to put the plan into action, he could only think about how everything had come to this point. But there was no time to lament. It was time to act and trust in the honest police officer that fate had put in his path. Brian seized the support patrol car lights reflecting on the wet asphalt, waiting for the final outcome. At dawn the next day, a heavy atmosphere hung over the neighborhood. The wet asphalt reflected the paleness of the overcast sky, while a police car discreetly stopped behind a parked truck, keeping its headlights off to avoid attention. Inside, Ramirez adjusted his belt and radio, casting quick glances through the window. Brian was on the other side of the street, in a recessed corner, holding the money bag with trembling hands. It seemed like a theater of horrors, the deserted street, the tension in the air, and the certainty that Davis would appear to fall into the trap. No one knew exactly how many minutes passed until a distant creak announced the approach of a dark car. It was a vehicle with no apparent police markings, with windows that were too dark. Brian, hidden in the shadow of a gate, felt his stomach turn. Now was the time. Ramirez had positioned the support vehicle near an abandoned bar, ready to act. Over the radio, he had ensured that reinforcements would arrive at any sign of confrontation. The car parked a few meters ahead. The driver's door opened, and Davis stepped out with his imposing presence, the posture of someone who had always ruled the area. Behind him, Clara appeared in her wheelchair, pushed by one of the accomplices. The scene was surreal. The same fragile lady now exposed as the cruel mastermind that Brian had discovered. Other men spread out along the sidewalk, forming a semicircle of intimidation. Brian swallowed hard, raising the money bag so they could see. He needed to provoke their reaction, make them talk. Fortunately, the private security camera installed atop an old building was active, recording every movement. Ramirez had observed this during the night, confirming that the equipment was still working. If Davis made the mistake of confessing, threatening, or acting violently, everything would be recorded. "Look who's back," Davis commented, approaching with an ironic smile. "So our boy brought the merchandise." Brian took a deep breath. "You deceived me. You said if I returned the money, everything would end well. But you almost killed me yesterday." Clara gave a dry laugh. "What did you expect? A toast of gratitude? The money is ours, kid. And you meddled in what you shouldn't have." Davis made a gesture with his hand, silent but full of meaning. One of the thugs advanced, touching Brian, trying to grab the bag. The boy stepped back half a step. He needed them to talk more, make their own guilt clear. "Why don't you just tell what you plan to do with this money?" Brian provoked, trying to sound firmer than he felt inside. "Extort merchants? Bribe people in the neighborhood? I can see in your eyes this isn't honest." Davis clicked his tongue, impatient. "Enough with the speech, kid. This money is the fruit of much sweat and blackmail. I won't let a brat and a handful of poor souls end our scheme. Now hand it over." Clara kept her gaze fixed on Brian, no longer the image of the vulnerable old lady, but rather someone who had long deceived the neighborhood. The wheelchair disguise had served to avoid raising suspicions, to appear as just a lady trying to survive. Now, however, the truth was before the lens of that distant camera. She and Davis were accomplices, and the dirty money was about to be recovered. "If you don't hand over the bag now, your family, well, let's say they'll have a sad ending," Clara whispered, as cold as the chilly wind. "We don't have time to waste with morality." Brian felt a shiver, his hands sweating on the bag handle. This was the moment Ramirez was waiting for. There, Davis and Clara were openly admitting to extortion and threats. The honest policeman wouldn't miss this chance. From the discreet car, Ramirez emerged, wielding his gun and shouting in a clear voice, "Police! Nobody move! You're all surrounded!" Ramirez's arrival caught Davis by surprise. The sergeant tried to react, but another police vehicle appeared at the end of the street, and two more officers appeared from the flanks, showing badges. The thugs looked at each other, confused, with nowhere to run. The trap was complete. The confessions had been recorded, the threats heard. There was no escape. "Davis, drop the gun!" Ramirez shouted, advancing a few steps. Davis gritted his teeth, trying to draw his pistol, but found himself in the sights of two police officers. There was no elegant way out, no bribe that would fix this. Clara realized it too, her expression hardening. An officer approached, removing her from the wheelchair and unmasking her completely. Her legs weren't inert, and the supposed problem was a trick. Everything recorded, documented. Brian watched it all with his heart pounding. The thugs surrendered one by one, hands on their heads. Davis, spitting insults, was forced to the ground, handcuffed and immobilized. Clara, with no way out, remained silent, knowing that the entire plan had gone down the drain. The dirt had surfaced. There was no more pretending. Ramirez, with a relieved look, approached Brian. "You were brave, kid. Without you, we wouldn't have succeeded. Now we have the evidence we need." The money bag was there, intact. Ramirez picked it up carefully, aware that it was crucial evidence. The dirty notes, scribbled, the gang's mark, everything pointed to criminal involvement. With this, the extortion victims could be identified, perhaps compensated, and the corrupt network dismantled. Brian didn't know what to say. He was relieved, but also shocked by everything that had happened. He thought about his family, his sick mother, his desperate father. He wouldn't have the money for himself, as it now belonged to the police case. But perhaps this exposure would lead the authorities to help the gang's victims, bring some help to the neighborhood. Ramirez patted his shoulder lightly, as a friend would do. "You won't be left helpless," said the police officer. "We'll take this as evidence. I guarantee your safety, kid." Hearing these words, Brian felt tears of relief burning in his eyes. He saw Davis being placed in the police car, Clara handcuffed, the wheelchair thrown aside, useless. Everything seemed so surreal. He had started by saving a woman in the rain and ended up exposing a criminal conspiracy. Now that everything was resolved, what would he do with his own life? Brian wonders, and now what to do with my own life? The local afternoon news showed footage of the prisoners entering the police station, escorted by officers. Davis kept his chin up, trying to look tough, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed the weight of defeat. Clara, without her wheelchair, kept her head down, avoiding looking at the cameras. Several victims of the gang were already giving statements, revealing the extortion and blackmail they suffered. The neighborhood was buzzing with comments, sometimes shocked, sometimes relieved. Finally, that dangerous group was out of circulation. Brian watched the news sitting on the couch at home, his father beside him, his sick mother wrapped in blankets in the bedroom. The family had heard the story through his words. The encounter with Clara in the rain, the money bag, Davis's sordid plot and his accomplices, the ambush at the warehouse, Ramirez's help. It all sounded unbelievable, but there was the evidence on television, confirming every detail. His father pressed his hand against his son's shoulder, proud. His mother, even weak, called him softly, wanting to hear more of his voice to reassure herself. "You saved our skin, son," said his father, his voice firm but eyes watery. "Even without that dirty money, I'm sure things will get better now. With this gang exposed, maybe the neighborhood will get a fresh start." The son's response was a contained smile. He was tired, with dark circles under his eyes, but felt something new in his chest. Hope. He knew nothing would be solved overnight, that the family would still face financial problems and his mother's delicate health. But now, without the threat of crime hanging over them, maybe the building owner would be more reasonable, or the neighbors would unite to help. In the late afternoon, Brian left home to take a walk around the block. The air was lighter, despite the remaining rain puddles. At the workshop, Jaime waited for him with a half-incredulous smile. His friend couldn't imagine how much Brian had risked, but knew something big was involved. The workshop owner, impressed with the young man's courage, after hearing rumors around the neighborhood, offered more working hours and a small raise. A simple gesture, but one that would already help with rent payment. Neighbors started appearing, offering small gestures of solidarity. A bottle of cough syrup for Brian's mother, some food, promises to refer customers to the workshop where he worked. It was as if the boy's bravery and Ramirez's honesty had inspired people to support each other. Perhaps there was a small chain of goodness forming in that forgotten corner of the city. Ramirez passed by, in uniform, greeting Brian with a wave. The two exchanged a knowing look. The officer held a brown envelope containing documents and photos collected in the case. There would still be a long legal process, trials and bureaucracy, but the essential was done. Davis and Clara's gang had fallen. Brian raised his hand in gratitude, and Ramirez smiled discreetly before continuing on his way. Later that night, the neighborhood was surprisingly calmer. The rain had completely stopped, and the sky, still overcast, let out a cool breeze. Brian walked to the corner where it all began. The place where he had helped Clara under the downpour, ignoring his own exhaustion. There were still marks of dried mud on the asphalt, paper remnants stuck to the sidewalk. A weak lamp illuminated the post, casting an elongated shadow. He remembered the feeling of doing something good without expecting anything in return. A pure kindness that unfortunately had thrown him into a whirlwind of problems. Even so, he didn't regret it. He had learned that the world is full of traps and deceitful people. He couldn't fix everyone's heart, but he could choose to keep his clean. Helping someone, even if that person later turned out to be bad, didn't invalidate his own goodness. His honesty persisted. Upon returning home, he felt lighter. There were still overdue bills, his mother's illness, his father without steady employment. But there was also the neighbors' solidarity, Ramirez's word that he would help where he could, and Brian's inner promise to continue fighting without straying from the right path. He had learned that having dirty money to escape problems wasn't worth it. It would only drag him into an even deeper well. Little by little, life would move forward. The workshop would receive more curious customers wanting to meet the brave boy. Maybe the owner would offer steady work to Brian's father, or some neighbor would know someone needing labor. Perhaps the building management would give them more days of grace now that the neighborhood was no longer under threat from the gang. Common generosity, awakened after the scandal, could be a more valuable currency than extorted money. Entering home, his mother's room was quiet, but she was sleeping better, breathing with a bit more ease. His father was scribbling something on paper, perhaps a plan for the future, a temporary job. Brian sat in a chair, watching the weak light from the lamp illuminate the peeling walls. No luxuries, no easy riches, but integrity was an asset he had earned at the cost of much risk. In the days that would follow, Brian's story would be told from mouth to mouth in the neighborhood. A boy who tried to help a lady in the rain and ended up dismantling a web of corruption. Some would see naivety, others courage. He cared little. What mattered was that, despite everything, he had chosen the right path. He hadn't bent to criminals, hadn't let himself be corrupted, and that was worth more than any amount of money. With Davis and Clara handcuffed, Ramirez asks Brian what he learned from all this. The boy, still confused, responds with a tired smile. "I guess fixing cars is easier than fixing people, but if there's something I learned, it's that genuine kindness doesn't need a monetary reward. It pays for itself." And as he walks away under the now merely cloudy sky, Brian concludes, "I'll try to be a shepherd, not a lost sheep," remembering the words that echo in his mind. In the midst of chaos, he chose the path of integrity